actually, well, that's interesting because during the Rape of Nanking, this card-carrying Nazi named John Robbe was like, wow, he was appalled by what was happening in like
A
the Rape of
Nazi was
Nanking.
appalled.
Yeah,
Oh,
that
wow.
he even wrote he even wrote to like the Nazi party like, hey, our friends, our Japanese friends are doing some pretty brutal things here. I'm not sure if we want to be friends anymore. And he like helped to save like 30,000 people in his little like international zone where he was displaying a Nazi flag on top of his like roof just to save people. And I'm just like, and when I was reading that, I was thinking like, wow, how messed up does it need to be that like a Nazi is saving people?
Welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. My guest today is Jenny Chan, the director of Pacific Atrocities Education, which works to increase awareness about atrocities committed in the Asia-Pacific theater during World War II. Now, you're doing incredible work. When I was exploring the website and the YouTube page, it made me realize like just how much I've taken for granted, how readily available and accessible European Holocaust education is. Like I grew up learning about death marches and human experimentation in young adult novels about the Holocaust. Whether or not that's healthy is for a different episode. But I didn't know that Japan was committing the same atrocities.
Yes, and it's continental size. Thank you so much for going on our website and also onto our YouTube. It's been hard work for like the last 10 years, not just researching, but also trying to make this accessible. We used to write blog posts and then we were writing small books because the blog posts became very, jumbled up with words. And lately, our generation is living with some kind of brain rot. So
Yeah.
then we have to make short videos. So now we're not only making YouTube videos, we're trying to trim it down to like 45 seconds to like 30 seconds. When I was reading a study that people cannot pay attention for like more than 7 seconds now, and I'm like, oh my god, how do I trim atrocities, which is like such a long story, down into like boom boom boom. And so yeah, hopefully that was engaging when you were on our YouTube channel.
Absolutely. And he did a great job. I that there was the like one-to-one-ness, the fact that there was a Japanese Joseph Mengele. So tell us about Unit 731. Let's get right into it.
Yeah, Unit 731 was a biological research lab that basically used humans as experimentation, and that was in Manchuria. Japan had occupied Manchuria in 1931, but his human experimentation, actually, he was interested in human experimentation and germ warfare because he had realized that there's a Geneva Convention that prevented that had the rules out for germs, and he thought, well, if germ warfare is so powerful that there's a Geneva Convention on it, so we need to use it. We need to weaponize it. So he harnessed that biological weapon, and he started a lab. And the reason how he got funding with the lab was that the emperor was also like a hobbyist biologist and was also very interested in what Ishishiro was doing. And during Russo-Japanese War, Japan they were having problem with their water. And so then so he came up with this water filter idea, and he peed in it and drank the filter pee in front of the emperor. And then the emperor was like, wow, I'm super impressed with this with this fellow, so I'm going to give him some money to start a lab. And at first he started the lab in Tokyo, and he was wildly popular because, he's a young scientist. He just got all this money. He's a womanizer. He's going to geisha district trying to like and so then he had like a lot of fans in the scientific community. So then I think that started down the fanatic thing up, and he started his own community called, like, it's kind of like the Ishi network, where then they would share like biological research and whatnot. And it was but then since his lab was in Tokyo, and Tokyo was a city, and he's afraid that, like, some Karen is going to turn him in.
Yeah.
And so
For drinking his own piss.
yes. Well, actually, no, he was starting to do human experimentation too. And there's like a recent article in the last 20 years that they dug when some developer was trying to build a building, they dug up like a bunch of skeletons. And so those are like Ishishiro skeleton. And so then he thought, well, you know what? Japan is going to occupy Manchuria. So why don't I move my lab location over there? So he took a road trip with his friends, and then he was like, okay, Manchuria could be a pretty good solution, given the fact that like there's such a vast piece of land and there's like not as many people as Tokyo. So he moved to Manchuria. So he picked the soy sauce factory at first, and then he got caught because his prisoners, who were going to be his human experimentation subjects, got escaped one night while like all of his prison guards were drinking and having a good time, and they broke out. And then so he thought, well, if I get caught again, I'm going to be busted, or I don't want anyone to find out about this. So then he found this village in Pingfan in China, which is all still Manchuria, occupied Manchuria. And he removed all of the villagers, and then he had a train system that go in there. And then he started his lab, and his lab was so big that there was even like a dormitory for his scientists to stay. He even had built a movie theater. He built a shrine. Basically created like I would call it like a Disneyland
Wow.
of human experimentation. And there's no neighbors for miles and miles. So it's like a very remote location that he created that.
Is it still up there? Does it exist now as a
Yes,
museum?
it's now a museum. It's Unit 731 Museum in Pingfan in China. So I highly recommend like people to go. And when I was doing research, it was so fascinating to see how big this space was in terms of like I was walking around, I'm like, it's just so dark, that like people can do this kind of thing in this kind of vast space.
Exactly. Yeah, for all intents and purposes, he got away with it, eh? Like, did he ever face justice for
No,
experimenting?
he was doing human experimentation. They were doing journals. So in like that era, if you see like Manchurian monkey, you can for sure know that it was a human experimentation kind of deal, because that it was an open secret, and everyone in the university to like hospitals really looked up to Ishishiro, and he never got away because he was able to make a deal with the CIA, who was thinking like, oh, this is really useful research that you did over here. So he made a deal, and he died from lung cancer from chain smoking.
Oh, so he
So
did.
yeah.
Yeah, so th- he he had all those human lungs at his disposal, and didn't figure out how to cure his own disease. He was just in it for the sick, sadistic love of the game.
But he actually did come up with like pretty, like, for example, frostbite. People think that like Unit 731, they were just doing human experimentation for funsies, but that's actually not true, because he actually came up with quite a few things. For example, like, because it was so cold, Manchuria is pretty close to Russia, and so then like you can use the the outdoor space as a freezer. And so
Oh,
then he put humans out on stakes and like lock them there, and then see how their exposed limbs will react in like 30 minutes and like an hour. And then like he would cut off the limbs and see what like what's going on inside with those like people's like limbs and whatnot. And that was actually how they came up with frostbite and like anthrax and glanders. And he was also trying to figure out like how to weaponize like anthrax. And in fact, Unit 731 came up with like the powder form of anthrax. And so yeah, it was all these like scientific research that led to like weaponizing and also like curing people in the field, I guess.
yeah, and that's objectively some of the most depraved shit I've ever heard in my life.
Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
that's what the pod is for. Thank you. I'm like, if I'm surprised Hollywood hasn't gotten to it yet. Like, are there stories of all the Pacific atrocities in your research? Like, what are stories that you think are most that would make great movies, whether they have happy endings, stories of heroism and resistance, or devastating endings, like Ishishiro gets away with it by cutting a deal with the CIA.
Think it's one story that really stood out to me, that and when I was researching, it's like um people everyone knows about Pearl Harbor, but people don't know that after Pearl Harbor, um the Roosevelt was really pissed, and so he sent his pilots out to bomb Japan, the Japanese mainland. And it was a one-way ticket because there was not enough fuel to fly back. They didn't have that kind. Um, and so then all these men were kind of risking their lives, and um, and then they bombed Japan, and then some of them made it to China, and the Chinese people really helped them, and to get back to the United States or get them to safety. And because the Chinese people had helped them, then Unit 731 went and like spread biological weapon on their land in these villages. And then these people lived for like 7 decades with like rotting legs when they were trying to like farm on their farmland, because then they had contracted glanders and anthrax. And so yeah.
Wow. Yeah, how did you get into this work?
Yeah, so my grandma suffered a lot during the occupation of Hong Kong. And I used to watch a lot of Japanese anime, and like I really like, watching Japanese TV and TV shows and whatever. And my grandma was like, "Oh, the Japanese people are actually evil. You have no idea, blah blah blah." I thought she was just being like racist. And it wasn't until like she really shared her experience, and then like she passed away, and we found like a box of military yen, and I was like, wow, and I remember her telling me that her family was forced to trade all of their money into military yen. If not, then they were going to face like execution. For example, her neighbors were facing execution because they didn't trade in their money. And my grandma was always this like really depressed individual, like, oh, I'm just waiting to die, blah blah blah. And like it really, now that I look back at it, I'm wondering like how much of it had to do with like survival during like early adulthood, that she had to survive this like kind of thing. And then so then it like really grimmed her other like life outlook, right? And yeah, and so and then after I found all these military yen and realized that what she was saying had some like merits, I started like searching for it. But then there was not really quite a lot of things that I could find at the time, because like the only like really well known book about Asia being occupied by Japan, it was Rape of Nanking by the late Iris Chang. And Iris Chang got so depressed that she committed suicide after writing the book. And it was just like so and for me, I feel like, wow, there's like a lot of things that are, because it's almost like in our culture, in Asian culture, to like not bring up taboo topics. And so then a lot of people live with like scars that are like in their mind, and they're kind of depressed about it, but they don't talk about it. And so then I started this nonprofit just simply because I wanted to know more. And if you think about it, if there were 30 million people who perished in Asia, right? That's the low estimate. Higher estimate says 42 million. So then the 300 million that was described in Iris Chang's Rape of Nanking book is like a small percentage in a way, because that's not even a million people. And so then I was thinking like there has to be a lot more stories that are more than just the Rape of Nanking. And so that's when I started going into a rabbit hole and really going full time. And it started out as a really hobby project. And now we have digitized more than 1 million pages from the National Archives of like primary source documents. We have done interviews with like survivors who not only survived the Japanese invasion in the Philippines, but also like these were like women who fought in Japan, I mean, against Japan in the Philippines. And the Philippines was also a very interesting story because they did not like the American occupiers at all. So when the Japanese showed up, they were like, "Oh my God, we're finally free!" Blah blah blah. But then when the Japanese showed up, they started like raping their women and like beheading people. And then they were like, "Oh gosh, okay, I guess we have to fight with the Americans against the Japanese invaders." And so then, like, and they were fighting for like some of these like guerrilla fighters were like fighting for 3 years with like limited supplies of weapons. It's not like they were a well-funded troop and whatnot, but these people were like radicalized to fight this war, simply because they were trying to protect their homes and their family and also like their friends. And so like when you see on TV like all this war and like battlefields, you think it's only battlefields, but like whatever you're fighting, right? You're fighting at someone's like local liquor store. You're fighting at like, the gas station that people actually use during civilian time. And like you're fighting at someone's like convenience store, and you're fighting at someone's park. So I think like when I was going through the Manila massacre, what had happened, because Japan was going to fight until their last man when MacArthur returned. And so then the whole Manila, the whole city turned into like a battleground. And I think that really, when I was researching about that, I was like, why is there not a Hollywood movie about this yet? This is like intense. The whole city got destroyed. 110 civilians got killed. And yeah, it's just it was just such interesting time with like so many like human stories in there. Sorry, I
Yeah.
just like went on and on. So feel free to ask me any question.
Oh my gosh, no, please. That's what the podcast is for. And yeah, something that I try to do with this podcast, or the reason why I wanted to start it, was to try to start telling stories of what war actually looks like growing up or from the media. If we see it's like very formal, very dignified, only people on the battlefields following their choreography, but no, it's people going into homes, taking on villages. And which brings me to what I think is the most egregious euphemism of all time, which is comfort women, which I learned about. So yes, does that term come from the Japanese?
Yes, the Ianfu. So, and it was very systematic. So wherever the Japanese empire went, there were comfort women. And so when people talk about the comfort women from World War II, they think about Korea. But the reason why they think that is because Koreans were their first colony. And what I've learned is that even in Southeast Asia, there were comfort women, and there were like tiers of like women that they would use. For example, the generals would get the Japanese woman, and then like the lower tier, and then the mid tier would get Korean women, and then like and then they would have like lower tier, which is like the local women who are for like their privates and their like the lower tier soldiers. And In 2015, I went and visited Shanxi this province where they had like comfort women, and it's like they were living in basically they were still kind of living in poverty 10 years ago, and I was asking them like, hey, and they have not talked about, being comfort women for decades because it's just a taboo topic in their village, and so they're not going to talk about being sex slaves for a war. But it's interesting because I think they were gotten so old that they were just like, okay, we're going to talk now. And it was just so happened that, I went there and I was able to actually like connect with them. And one of the stories that still stuck with me to this day is that like one of the women had gotten pregnant because they were brutally raped like 50 times a day, some of them. And like, so one of them got pregnant, and her mom was like, well, we can't let people know. We can't let other people know that you were pregnant. And so then she hid in her home after, like, even after the Japanese lost the war, she hid in her home until she gave birth. Then her mom and her like snuck into like a local cave and just buried their child because
Oh
they
my
did
God.
not want other people to know. So there are consequences to like wars, and like you said, right? When you see in movies, it's all like this choreography and blah blah blah. Everyone is like dressed in the perfect like uniform, but in reality, it's a lot messier than that. And there are consequences to people who are like living in those places where the wars are being fought.
Yeah, that's devastating. And so I'd love to hear about the recent conference that you guys did. I read the article in the Korea Times, and was incredibly moved reading about the storytelling sessions that you had survivors and descendants of war criminals present. So tell us
Yeah.
about the conference.
Yeah. So it's interesting because one of our speaker was survive the war in China when she was a young kid, and it's always so touching to hear her story because her brother then died from starvation, because her village was looted, and her and her child, and that was like her early childhood, right? And so that has really always affected her. But eventually but she came to the United States like a decade later, and she used to never talk about it. And then one day her late husband brought her to see like a war movie, and she was crying so hard that like her late husband had to carry her home because like it was it hit her. It hit her, it reminded her of her childhood. And so the first time that she shared the story with us, and we did like a cross we did the Holocaust Day of Learning, and she was telling the story in front of a bunch of high school students, and she was crying by the end of it. Just because, like, even though it happened like 70 years ago, it still hit her that her brother died from starvation during the war, and she always, in her story, she always says that I wish I was the one who died. Then,
Oh,
yeah, and it's just like that kind of like emotional impact when you really hear someone who survived a war, even when they're like early childhood, even if it happened 70 years ago, that kind of scar never goes away. And yeah, and now she donates to a nonprofit because she really believes in telling these kind of stories because it needs to be told. And then also we did a video. You can also find it on our YouTube, Pacific Front Untold. And when one of our video, we have this guy whose father worked at Unit 1644. In fact, no one knows what 1644 did. There might be like three pieces of paper I found, and it was similar to Unit 731, but it was in Nanjing. And even he after his father passed away, he found a bunch of boxes of items, but he is confused about what his father did in the war because he suspects it's close to like what Unit 731 did. And And he said that a lot more research needs to be told about the Pacific War. I mean, needs to be done about the Pacific War. And can you imagine, like, a whole continent was at war? And yet there's like, in Japanese sources, he was so excited when he found like a box. I mean, when he found like a list of people who were in unit for 1644, but he said like, oh, the people always quote me, but I have no idea. And then he's also trying to find it in Japanese and he can't find it. So like a whole continent was at war. And there's like not too much that's still out there. Some of the items that I'm scanning at the National Archives are like very fragile pieces of paper because they're 80 years old. They're like, because during the war, there was so little like resources that they're using like onion peel paper. And
Wow.
in the Civil War, I mean, even the Civil War records are better kept because they're like, they were using cotton paper. So that's just a little like tidbit. And of course the Japanese also burned a lot of the documents by the time they surrendered. So whatever we can find is just like by luck or by chance. And so the whole continent was at war, but yet there's not too many stories that, or like we still need to do research about it like 80 years later.
And yeah, I I've never been to Asia. I haven't yet. So I know in Europe, there's monuments and memorials. Is there a same monument and memorial culture in Asia, or no? Those stories, for most of the part, it remains taboo to
So
talk about the war.
in Korea, there's like a protest against the Japanese embassy every Wednesday because of their colonial memory. They gather at Iwa Women University. They go protest the Japanese embassy every Wednesday. When I was going there, I went to visit, and my Airbnb host was like, "Oh, you want to join me in my protest?" Like, apparently, it's like a cultural thing
Oh,
to do, and so they really try to keep their memories alive. But like in Japan, for example, right? Um, they're currently their prime minister Sanae is still was used to visit the Yasukuni Shrine very often, and the Yasukuni Shrine was where they really enshrined all of the war criminals. So imagine if like Germany had like a shrine for Hitler or like all these war criminals.
yeah,
That
I'm like, they at least had the decency to turn the Führer bunker into a parking lot.
But yeah, and so then every single time like a politician would go and whatever, Korea and China would go all up in arms, and we don't really blame them because of their historical scars. And but what's interesting is that like in so yeah, Japan still their politicians still kind of worship the war criminals because their current day ruling party is the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP. And the LDP was actually founded by a Class A war criminal from World War II. And I was mentioning about Manchuria earlier, when Japan invaded Manchuria, this guy came up with the economic policy to exploit Manchuria. And he had enslaved like, I think 4 million Chinese and Koreans to work and build all these like factories in industry and coal mining, and about 40%, so like 1.6 million people died from his economic plans. And he's had this like theory that Chinese people are lesser and like Korean people are lesser than Japanese, and the Japanese are like this greater race of Asia. And so after the war, he was shut in Sugamo prison with all of these other war criminals. But then Cold War happened, and Eisenhower needed Japan to fight China. And so then
The classic, yeah, get out of jail free card.
yes, so even though that he had done mass murder in World War II, he got out of jail and then he got out of prison and then he became prime minister of Japan
My God.
in 10 years, in less than 10 years,
Wow, what a
due to
glow
the
up.
help due to the help of CIA and Eisenhower. And so it's very fascinating what politics can do in terms of like getting in the way of justice. And so today you have earlier I was talking about the current day prime minister. Prime minister is Sanae, and this Kishi who went from war criminal to prime minister. His grandson was Abe Shinzo. Are you following me? The Abe Shinzo who was assassinated.
Yeah, with the like 3D printed DIY gun. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I
so
didn't know he was a Nepo baby.
yeah, he was a nepo baby. So you get it. So like
Yeah.
you talk about war memory. There's no war memory if the war criminals are in power. And Sanae, I think, was working in his cabinet. And what's interesting is that also in the Japanese ruling party, there was this party member. His name is Taro Aso, and Taro Aso's like family owned like mining industry in Japan during Imperial Japan, and he was using POWs as slave laborers. So you see like a bunch of like Australian POWs who are like to work to their bone, and the ASO mining group that's also in like the ruling party, like government party member. So there's really no war memory. If you're going to just, if yeah.
That's so interesting. I want to hear more about the like yeah, the Japanese Aryan race equivalent. So reading about like the Japanese Mangala and the death marches, how alike were Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, like not only in methods but also ideologically? Like, did they share notes?
Actually, well, that's interesting because during the Rape of Nanking, this card-carrying Nazi named John Rabe was like, wow, he was appalled by what was happening in like
A
the Rape of
Nazi was
Nanking.
appalled.
Yeah,
Oh
that
wow.
he even wrote he even wrote to like the Nazi party, like, hey, our friends, our Japanese friends are doing some pretty brutal things here. I'm not sure if we want to be friends anymore. And he like helped to save like 30,000 people in his little like international zone where he was displaying a Nazi flag on top of his like roof just to save people. And I'm just like, and when I was reading that, I was thinking like, wow, how messed up does it need to be that like a Nazi is saving people?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like, and I'm surprised that that's not a movie yet.
And also, let's go back to the war memorial thing. So, the Philippines had a comfort woman statue, but then the Japanese diplomat and ambassadors told them to take it down because of how Japan is currently economically supporting the Philippines, and so then they had to take down their comfort woman statue.
They're still that like threatened by yeah, just yeah, by a singular statue. I was worried you were going to say that people were like groping it, which we've seen like with many other statues. But no, the fact that they had to take it down is worse.
Right. And so it's just like, in terms of talking about war memory and like, yeah, it's just very, how are you going to reconciliate when another party is still going to not admit or have the war criminals still be in power, right? So that's, I think that also has to do, at first when I was studying this, I was thinking, oh, it might be a niche market, it might be a niche thing to study like Asian history and like look at what had happened. But then now I look more and more at it, you can't understand current day geopolitical situation without understanding what had happened like 80 years ago.
Yeah. So, how does the shadow of World War II reflect in contemporary international politics? So, I guess it's not really a shadow if the party is still in power.
I don't think it's a shadow either.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's a very hard thing to talk about, right? Because so during the rape of Nanking, like if you think about it, 300,000 people, that's a lot of people. And they were having like contests where they can to see how many a Japanese soldier can kill in with a sword. So then they were having 100 men sword killing contest. And at the time, the Japanese newspaper would even display like, oh, one of the officer was having so much fun killing people that he just reached to 150 without realizing it. And so we're going to start the counter again, and they're going to kill like 100 other people just to see who can kill faster. And it's, I mean, and you talk about like, and then in the Yasukuni shrine that I was mentioning about, they have a museum where they actually deny everything. They would call it like, oh, Nanjing incident. It was a Nanjing incident. And so then when, like, for example, when politicians go to Yasukuni Shrine, they get pissed off and whatnot. And also nowadays with Taiwan, I don't know if you heard about this. A few days ago or like a few weeks ago, thought that she really had Donald Trump's backing, and then started making threats of invading China. If China is going to invade Taiwan, invading Taiwan was never on China's like political agenda. So I think she was just saying that just to say it, because she's super popular with like the Japanese public, because she's like super nationalistic and she's a tough woman. Um, and so then a bunch of people in China got triggered and then started posting like pictures of Rape of Nanking. Because once you talk about like Japan is really going to build up their military and going to invade China again, people see Rape of Nanking, people see Unit 731, people are like having all these imaginations. And so, or historical memory of like what had happened. And so then it starts a whole thing on like on social media. And then it's just like there's just like constantly fighting on my Instagram. Whenever I like look at it, I'm like, wow, there was like there people are like Asian people are like constantly fighting about something that had happened. And it's like they can't stop. I mean, I can't really blame them for still fighting about it, because it happened 80 years ago and was not acknowledged. And now she's talking about invading China. So it's just very interesting kind of like geopolitical things that are being played out. And also, one thing that is also worthy of notice is that the other prime minister that recently got recalled before this woman was voted in, he acknowledged the rape of Nanking and he acknowledged the Japanese war crime. And that's why he was part of the reason why he was recalled. And he's not popular. He was not popular. He had like 30% rating. People called him, he was being too weak and blah 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 blah. But I think it actually takes courage to have acknowledged what had happened, like what your country had done.
So, is there like that appetite for like, do they have like that make Japan imperial again movement?
Yes, actually, have you seen all of these like protesters against like Chinese tourists? Even they were like, "Oh, we don't like Chinese people here," and then they
Oh
would
my
like
God.
take one thing that like a Chinese person has done. For example, like not eating the whole strawberry. Like one Chinese tourist had not finished eating one whole strawberry, and then like someone would take a photo and then post it on Instagram, and then they're like, "This is how wasteful Chinese pigs are. You see, this person had not finished eating the strawberry."
My
And I
gosh.
was reading that like on social media. I'm like, oh my God, I feel personally attacked. I'm like, what the hell is going on that you have to finish a whole strawberry? I mean, sometimes I throw away food if it doesn't taste good, right?
Yeah, you know what's even more wasteful than not finishing a berry is the environmental impacts of invading another country. Like they gotta check out the gotta think through the logic of their anti-Chinese propaganda more. Yeah, damn, that's so interesting. Because do you get the sense like in America that people look at Asians as a monolith, and so the
Yeah.
intra Asian beefs are fascinating.
Well, but then it's also interesting too because in San Francisco we were installing a comfort woman statue, and a bunch of Japanese Americans came up and like started protesting. And
Wow.
that's something that like I was not expecting. And like I remember this one Japanese American guy was like, "Oh, this is going to just add to the victimhood and whatever," which is fine. You know, you can make all this kind of statements you want to make. You know, free country, say whatever. And then he was saying, "Oh, Iris Chang came to my dream and told me that the Rape of Nanking is fake and whatnot." And I'm thinking like, wow, if Iris Chang is showing up in your dream, you have like a bigger problem
Yeah.
than like the comfort woman statue.
I know. I wish. Yeah. If
He needs some help.
I guess, yeah, that's how we fight atrocity denial is like the movie Inception. We got to go into people's dreams.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's just so incredible that, and then they want to talk about and it's like a lot of things, for example, Unit 731. So when the Soviet had gone in to like capture Unit 731, and then they captured some of the scientists who have not fled yet. And then they put them in trial. And so a lot of what we find out, like what the public was finding out about Unit 731 was like from these trials in the 70s. And when it was coming out in the 70s, then America was like, "Oh, this is communist propaganda. You cannot trust it." But it turned out like 50 years that later that it was actually mostly true. And so now I'm like learning from history. So I'm like, when someone is being called a communist propaganda, we should learn from it. It's
Yeah,
probably true.
that'll be great. Yeah, we'll see the comments under this video. We'll see if the commenters go there. One thing that I wanted to talk about. So we covered just Imperial Japan, the most cartoonish, horrible shit, human experimentation, mass rape, and then there's a page on the website about cannibalism. What is?
Oh, yes, that happened. And that was like the craziest thing I've heard like anyone do. And nowadays I please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are doing 2 episodes per month with James Bradley, and who wrote The Flags of Our Fathers, and he also wrote this book called Flyboys. And in one of the episodes he explained why he did Flyboys. Iris Chang had apparently the late Iris Chang had apparently called him and said, this old guy keeps calling me and he's just too crazy for me, so why don't you call him back? And he called the guy back, and the guy said that, "Oh, I was in the secret war crime trial, and I think I want to tell the story before I die." And the story was about how there were 9 airmen who flew to Chichijima. 8 of them uh were hanging out with the Japanese officers and whatnot, and then later the Japanese officer barbecued their liver, and then the 9th guy who escaped was George Bush. And apparently James Bradley then brought George Bush to Chichijima to see like where it all happened, and they verified that it was true. And it was like one of the Bushido code that is like to eat your enemies and whatnot. So then yeah, and so it was like yeah, and so if you read his book, I read his book and I was like, wow, this is like messed up. These times were really messed up. So that's why people get offended when you don't finish eating the whole
Yeah,
strawberry.
yeah, exactly. It all comes back to the strawberry.
And also, what's very interesting about this is that like later Spielberg apparently reached out to James Bradley, and then that Flyboys book turned into one of the episode of The Pacific on HBO.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I keep thinking, like, I wonder, there are many reasons why detonating both the atomic bombs on civilians in Japan was wrong. But then did it kind of like help them get away with it? Like, it helped like Japanese people say, like, no, we're victims. We're the victims of World War II, not perpetrators.
Right, exactly. And then they always have these memorial museum out, but then why do they never talk about the Rape of Nanking or Unit 731 at these war memorial peace museum too, right? And if you think about it, right, you think about the war in Asia, sometimes some people only think about like Pearl Harbor and then they jump to the atomic bomb. And so then they just see it as like the time of warfare. Does warfare need to be so brutal that like 300,000 people get killed in 6 weeks? And recently realized that 300,000 people is actually more than two of the atomic bombs combined together. The death toll.
Yeah, it's World War II is especially interesting. I did like an episode earlier because it's still the war people go back to say that war is good. Like anytime there's an issue, they're like, well, of course, military force will make things better. Like World War II, we beat the Nazis, and then it's like, what did you think World War II was? Like there has to. I call me naive, but I feel like there's got to be a better way to solve problems, eh?
Yeah, diplomacy, right? But then it's actually interesting because I found this Konoe. He was like prime minister of Japan like 3 times, and his name was Prince Konoe. And it was very interesting to find his memoir. Right after the war, he committed suicide because he was afraid of what was coming for him.
Wow.
But yeah, so this guy had nothing to lose when he was like writing his memoir before he committed suicide. And he was talking about how he knew the war was coming, but he couldn't put a stop to it. And he was supposed to be like a civilian cabinet member, but then the military war hawks have already taken over the government. And so if you think about it, right, these military war hawks are like today what we will call like a neocon, who was trying to build this military industrial complex. And so they were pushing the country to war. And then whenever he tried to go against these people, they would threaten to kill him. And so but then whenever they need a position that is done, so then they will call him and say like, oh yeah, you got a hold of the civilian government, right? Like you got this, right? So he was like the spare tire that was being put every single time they were trying to like not get off the cliff, but then they put him on as a spare tire, and then they drive the truck down the cliff anyway. And so what what I'm trying to say is that like sure he could have like negotiated it out of it, but I think the government was already so radicalized that there was nothing that was going to get them to negotiate their way out because of certain people in the faction.
Yeah, the way I feel like, yeah, we see it often. Once people have their minds made up, they'll go to war, especially when it's not them who has to do the fighting. People are so
Yeah, exactly. And
will
it's so
happily
yeah.
send other people's kids to die. Like,
And
why
they are
not?
so happy when their stocks go up. They're like,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, my stocks are gonna go up," but like, at what human cost, right? So yeah,
Yeah, so I'm grateful that you're doing the work and focusing on the human costs. And damn, I still can't stop thinking about the Nazi who said that they went too far. Like, yeah, to out Nazi the Nazis is no small feat. Do you have any other books coming out that?
so we had a major release. I'm pretty sure you read about it on the Korean Times about the Quantum Army, and that to me was very fascinating because
Yes, what?
the Quantum Army staged the invasion of China, and yet no English literature was out about it. I had never seen a book about the Quantum Army. And so then we were researching, and it was very interesting because when Japan took Manchuria, then the United States was like, oh, we're not going to recognize Manchukuo. But then if you think about it, right, like 3 decades before Japan occupied Manchuria, um Teddy Roosevelt was bringing the Japanese Baron Kaneko to Wall Street to fundraise for to build up Japanese military. And so, in a sense, the United States helped Japan to build up this imperialist power. And so,
It's all fun and
and
games until they bomb you.
yes, it's all fun and games until this power gets so uncontrollable. And one of the reasons why United States did not recognize Manchuria was that at this time the United States was also exploiting China with their open door policy. And so if Japan occupies China, that means that they would close the door on this unequal trade that they were having going on with China. And so I think politics really play politics and profit, I think, is like the center of all these war stories. And it is it's very fascinating of what greed can really do.
Yeah. And yeah,
Sorry.
no, thank you. No, that's it. And it's, I guess it's kind of nice that greed is a universal human emotion, that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, there will be. It's
Yeah.
the same. Oh God, yeah. The same nastiness, the same selfishness, the same racism.
Yeah. And and yeah, and in order for you to do mass killing, mass human experimentations, and like attack another country and like basically destroy cities, you need to think that you're better than them, and you need to think that like, oh, this is, I'm the greatest neighbor in Asia. Like, why not? Why can't I control the whole continent? And so yeah, it's just very interesting that that's what they chose to do. And if you think about it too, right? Like all these comfort women and all these issues, it doesn't it then date back to like when Teddy Roosevelt tried basically help Japan get stronger. And one of the biggest reason why Teddy Roosevelt helped Japan instead of helping other Chinese people or like helping their neighbors was because at this time during Meiji Restoration, Japan has sent all of their diplomats out to learn English, to go to Harvard, go to Yale. And so then they were more like Teddy Roosevelt. And so then it's this like idea of like assimilation. So yeah, it's just very fascinating, and I don't think that like people realize like how much the US have had to do, like what kind of disastrous policy that US have played in Asia in like the last century even.
Yeah, in the 80 years since, the U.S. still be meddling as they
And
do.
also, if you think about it too, right? Like, going back to your story about how U.S. Um, has been justifying their military spend, but like, have they realized that they haven't really won a war in like the last 80 years?
Right.
They
Yeah.
would win against like smaller military armies. So like, why are we still spending on this military spending when our roads are not fixed, when there are like homeless people on the street and there's, people are getting jumped going to the nightclubs? Like, why are we still spending all this money for like the military industrial complex? It's just it's a waste of our money.
Yeah, thank you. And it's so, and it, yeah, hence the name of the podcast, War is Stupid. Like, it's just so transparent.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you. I'm so grateful. If you'll see behind me, I'm a theater kid, so everything I knew about Asian history was either through the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical South Pacific, which not very good politics, but beautiful music. And then there's also a Sondheim musical called Pacific Overtures about American imperialism in Japan. And there's a whole sequence of like Commodore Perry coming to
Oh,
Japan.
yes. Maybe we can do an episode about that later down the line.
Yes, if you want to do a musical theater crossover
No, not musical
episode
theater, but
on
I
Commodore
think like,
Perry.
yeah.
But
You can like, We can like play it, and then we can like talk about the historical background and whatnot.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so grateful. I think yeah, it's crucial to explore and tell and preserve these stories, A, because the people who lived them deserved it, deserve to be remembered, and B, because yeah, it's terrifying what humans are capable of. Like,
Definitely.
thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell your dads. We'll see you next time.